swear I just saw somebody standing over my shoulder. Hey, what's going on today, guys? It's Trey. Welcome back to the channel. Today we are here in the beautiful town of Esslingen, Germany to take a ghost tour. So this is the very first ghost tour that I've ever been on in my life. I just want to give a huge shout out to Stuttgart Steps. They're the company that's going to be hosting us on this tour this evening. If you're not into ghosts, if you're not into haunts, if you're not into fright, they do offer a number of other tours as well. World War II tours, Christmas market tours, they do wine vineyard tours, pretty much anything that you could think of history related, they offer. So they're an amazing company. I highly recommend you guys check them out. Now, during the day, Esslingen is a magnificent, charming city. But once night falls, this city transforms into what I've heard is one of the most haunted towns in all of Germany. So I'm really interested to see what we find on this tour. Now, the tour this evening is gonna be about an hour and a half long. So I just want you guys to sit back, relax. Let's go hunt some ghosts.
All Saints Day was also known as All Hallows Day. Last night was All Hallows Eve. That's where we get the concept of Halloween. So it was believed that this was the day where you were supposed to honor various people who had passed before, especially the most holy among us. And this was practiced in the ancient days by giving out bread representing the souls of those who had passed, especially to poor and to children people who had come to your house. This is where the modern custom of trick-or-treating comes from. So this is, like I said, this is my favorite tour. I do historical tours, I do wine tours. I only do this one during late October because I really just like getting all of the macabre and spooky stuff I came across in my research, all condensed into one tour in the beautiful medieval city of Esslingen. Johannes Haus was not just a judge, he was also a minister at the Stadtkirche, the big church here. And he was a witch hunter. He was obsessed with witches. And he saw witches everywhere. Failed crop, witches. Dead cow, witches. Stillbirth, witches. Witches were behind everything in his mind. And in the sermons he gave from the church, he shared his paranoia with everybody, and this started to become a panic. And actually one of the last witch panics in southern Germany happened right here, starting that year in 1662. What happened was a young boy, a servant boy, of course, who attended church, he reported to the local pastor that he had made a pact with the devil. In fact, this is the only case that's happening. He actually reported that he had had congress with the devil. It was very common for women to report having some sort of sexual activity with the devil. This is the only time this happened with a male child. But he reported this, and it was taken seriously by Johannes Haus. So the boy was imprisoned and he was interrogated, and he was pressured to name other people who also had made pacts with the devil because no one believed that it could just be one person. There had to be a coven. So he started naming all sorts of other people, mostly teenagers. He started naming maybe the kid who stole his bread, maybe the servant girl who was mean to him, and before you know it, other kids are being arrested and they're accusing other people, and this is where you get the full-blown witch panic from. And it's truly tragic because, of course, even in those days, as barbaric as they seem to us now, there was still local church authority who said this is ridiculous. Maybe the kids' visions were demonically inspired, but they are not witches. They're too young. This can't be possible. So Johannes Haus was ordered to stop the interrogations, but he appealed to the Bishop of Strasbourg, who said, actually, yes, there's probably a witch problem, and then they continued. In the course of 3 years, 271 people were implicated for witchcraft, and over 79 were imprisoned and probably tortured. It is one of the last recorded witch trials that actually happened in southern Germany. Really tragic. Again, and what happened, what modern historians think probably happened, is that the boy who started it all, between the sermons he heard from Johannes Haus, and he was probably being abused maybe by an older serving person where he worked. This is where, that in his mind, that's where everything came from. That's his way of expressing his trauma. Johannes Haus died 3 years later, and as soon as he died, the witch craze just stopped. People who were still in prison were released, and everything went back relatively to normal.
Guys, that story is so crazy, and it actually reminds me of the Salem witch trial. So if you guys are familiar with American history, that was one of the craziest events. Took place in New England, and basically a lot of innocent people ended up dying, and they were called witches. So it was pretty nuts.
St. Dionysius was the largest church for a couple of decades in the Holy Roman Empire. Now, there's been a church on this site since at least 770, not 1770, 770. So we're talking over 1,000 years. Now, that church, this was in Esslingen, it was a smaller town at its very beginnings as a major city. That church held the bones of a saint. That saint was Saint Vitalis. He was a Roman soldier, and he converted to Christianity, which really angered the Emperor Nero. You might have heard of Nero, he's not that popular. For the resurrection, all you needed was the skull and the femur of the body that was buried to basically complete the resurrection. So all of the people buried here were dug up. Most of the bones were discarded, but they were very careful to keep the skull and the femur bone for every single person, and then house them in this, which became a chapel, so it was also hallowed ground. So it was called an ossuary. And so you might be familiar with the catacombs of Paris or the famous Bone Church in the Czech Republic. That's essentially what this was as well for nearly 300 years. However, when the Reformation happened, when the city changed from being Catholic to being Protestant, the Protestants didn't share these same beliefs. So what happened then was that this was made the city archive, and the bones were simply dispersed. We actually don't know what happened to any of the bones.
So I know it's a holiday today, but this town is literally like a ghost town. I've barely seen anybody. It's like eerily quiet, but it's making the tour so much better.
He didn't know that on that very spot 2 years ago, a wealthy merchant had been murdered. So he's watering his horse and he sees something shining in the ground. He goes to pick it up. It's a ring. It's made of gold. It has rubies and emeralds. It's worth a lot of money. And Michael thinks, well, if I return this ring to its owner, I'll probably get a great reward. So he puts the ring on his finger so he doesn't lose it. And then he comes here to what used to be called the Fish Mart in Esslingen. This was the fish market because there was an old medieval fountain here where fish was actually kept in the fountain so it'd be fresh. So he came to the fish market and he blowed his postman's horn. This is the circular horn that you can see up here that is still a symbol of Deutsche Post today. If you go to mail a letter, you'll see that circular horn is part of the symbol. That comes from the old horn they used to blow. Everyone would come and collect their mail, and he's telling everybody, look at this ring that I found. Does anyone know who it belongs to? And all of a sudden, the word spreads really fast throughout the city. Everyone's whispering, people are going to their neighbors' houses, and suddenly, into the tavern bursts a man. And he says, let me see that ring. He examines the ring, and on the inside, there's an insignia of initials, and the man says, this belonged to my uncle. He was a wealthy merchant that was murdered 2 years ago. He says, we never found the killer. If you have his ring, that means you might have murdered him. And perhaps you thought that after 2 years, everyone would forget about him and his riches, and now you could pawn the ring off. So the guards were called of the city, and poor Michael was imprisoned and taken to the Wolf's Gate. So at the Wolf's Gate, Michael was tortured. This was customary at the time. We're talking, the legend comes from the late 1400s. In those days, you weren't presumed innocent until you were proven guilty. It was actually the opposite. You were presumed to be guilty if you were accused, and you could prove your innocence by withstanding torture. Now, of course, we know today that under enough torture, everyone will eventually give a false confession. And after months, that's what happened to poor Michael. He gave a false confession just to stop the pain, and then he was sentenced to death by beheading. So, on his way to the gallows, riding his horse, he asked to blow his postman's horn one more time. When the horn blew, it made such a sound that the entire city felt like it shook the city. Then, on the gallows, looking at the crowd that assembled to watch the execution, he found the nephew of the man who'd been murdered. He points to him and says, it is for your inheritance that I go to my grave. And just like that, the executioner lopped off his head. 1 year later, on the evening of September 29th, in Stuttgart, at the Marktplatz, a ghostly figure on a horse appeared. And it was actually the executioner who saw it first, for he was actually the executioner of Stuttgart, who had been hired by Esslingen to execute Michael. He saw the man on the horse carrying his head in his hand, and then once again that earth-shattering blow from the horn was sounded. And then people all along the way observed him riding his old route from Stuttgart to Esslingen, where he appeared before the door of the nephew of the man who'd been murdered, blowing his horn until he faded. Now, this just happened one time a year, but it kept happening every year. So eventually, the nephew decided to flee. He went to Vienna, he went to Venice, but everywhere he went, on September 29th, the same ghostly figure would haunt him. Until finally, decades later, he comes to Esslingen, he goes to the old Katharina-Spital, which we'll see later in the tour, and he collapses in front of a nun. And she gives him water and asks him how she can help. And he says, I can't do it anymore. I can't keep running from this ghost. It is I who killed my uncle for his inheritance. And then he collapsed dead. And so the city felt really bad for getting the wrong guy. So they made a little monument to him. There he is with his horn. The old fish mark was replaced right around 1890 with this beautiful fountain that you see here today. This tale is actually celebrated on St. Michael's Day, which is September 29th, as a children's festival where children actually perform the story outlined above.
So I know this is something that has occurred regularly throughout human history, but it's just amazing how cutthroat humans can be. Could you imagine killing a family member for their wealth? And I mean, we see this happen to this day, but it's just so insane how over thousands and thousands of years we've seen history continuously repeat itself when it comes to people just being envious and cutthroat. It's pretty sad, actually.
Oh, if you look up here, you can see some lights up there on that hill. Normally this is all lit up. Unfortunately, due to the energy restrictions, due to the energy crisis, due to the war in Ukraine, no longer is the wall floodlit. But what you're looking up there is actually the old city wall. It was placed up on that hill because if the opposing forces, let's say the forces of Württemberg, the Duke, who was often trying to attack Esslingen, was able to get up there with some flaming arrows, he could easily destroy the city. So they extended the city wall all the way up the hill. There's actually vineyards between there and the hill. And the little house with a bunch of the windows up there, that is called the Watchman's House. And that's where the tragic events of this story take place. So the year is 1688, and the 9 Years' War is going on. There were a lot of wars during this period. This was one of those times when France and what is now Germany were battling back and forth, and the area of Alsace and the Rhineland switched control between France and Germany many times. And if anyone's been to Heidelberg and seen the castle there, so you know that it's destroyed, basically. That was this war. So things were very, very tense, and everyone was afraid if they made the wrong move that Malek would choose to attack the city. Meanwhile, before all this started, a local pastor in a village that didn't have walls was worried about this war, so he sent his daughter, Anna Katerina, who was 17, to Esslingen to stay at the Golden Eagle Inn as a serving girl. This was the biggest inn in town, actually. So Golden Eagle is Golden Adler in German. So you can actually see Adlerstrasse just 2 blocks over that way, and that's where once the Golden Eagle stood. One night while serving, the general grabs her arm, and he says, "Oh, you're a pretty one." And she wrestles away, and he immediately goes to the innkeeper and says, "I want to meet her." She, of course, runs to the other serving girls and starts, she's totally afraid. Malek is, again, known for his brutality. But they're worried that if she doesn't agree to his request, he'll burn the city down. So arrangements are made that the next night they're going to meet up there in the old watchman's house on the city walls. So frightfully, nervously, Anna goes up the 325 steps along the wall that you can still walk today to the watchman's house. And as soon as she enters, Malek grabs her roughly and pulls her inside. She panics and she grabs a dagger out of her skirts and she goes to stab him right in the heart. But as soon as her knife meets his chest, there's a loud clang because he wore his breastplate under his shirt, fearing that she might attack him. In his rage that she would even dare to attack him, he grabs the knife from her and starts stabbing her over and over in a rage until suddenly he comes to and realizes that this poor innocent girl is dead in a pool of blood beneath him.
So real quick, we're taking a little bit of break from the tour, but I just wanted to share probably the craziest encounter with a ghost that I've ever had. Now, I was somewhat of a skeptic growing up because I just didn't want to believe that ghosts exist, right? And then something happened that completely changed my life. So if you guys are new to the channel, I grew up in the state of Florida, which obviously has a ton of history, a ton of violent history. And so my neighborhood that I grew up in was actually built on an Indian burial ground. So very crazy. No, it wasn't a rumor. It was actually confirmed by the community that I lived in. And so strange things would happen all the time at my house. Stuff would come up missing, items would be moved, lights would turn on, lights would turn off. Our pool system would magically just stop working. Just a bunch of unexplainable things happened all the time where I grew up. But despite all of the crazy and pretty scary things that happened, nothing could prepare me for this one situation that happened. I think I was 13 or 14 years old. I was in middle school getting ready to go to high school. But one night I walked downstairs to the kitchen and I turned on the light, and guys, I kid you not, I saw an apparition standing right by the fridge, just standing there, right? And it didn't go away immediately. It just was there, and I couldn't believe it. It had long hair, and it was just standing there. Like, it wasn't doing anything, it wasn't moving. And as I continued to move closer, that's when it just disappeared. And so, I've told this story to people. People probably think that I'm crazy by mentioning it, but so yeah, that happened. And then, believe it or not, a few years later, I saw the same apparition in my house. And so the older and I'm actually getting chills as I'm telling this story, but I was a little bit afraid at first, but like the more research that I did, I discovered that they will feed off of that. They will feed off of your energy. I tried to do my best by being as positive as possible in my home, but very crazy stuff. But yeah, that's my ghost story. Let me know in the comment section below what your crazy ghost story is. My wife hasn't had an interaction with ghosts, and hopefully she never does. But let me know about your ghostly encounter.
Torture had to fall inside of a Christian framework, and it was believed that drawing blood was unholy because the blood of Christ is what provided salvation to man. Therefore, you didn't want to draw blood during torture. So the executioner, he was usually the torturer, had all these inventive methods to basically cause great amounts of pain without drawing blood or injuring the person so much that they would die. The most famous of these is the rack. So this shows an interrogation scene, and you guys can pass this around and get a better look at it. That's an interrogation scene of a man who is being tortured on the rack. The chair is another famous example of this. That is a chair full of spikes. And you think, well, yeah, the spikes would draw blood. Not while the man is being questioned. It's afterwards, when the questioning stops and he gets off of the chair full of spikes, that, yeah, blood happens. But that scene is not that big of a deal because during the questioning, no blood is drawn. So there are two different types of executions. Once the confession has been extracted or the person is found guilty, there are regular executions and there's torturous executions. So regular executions, the easiest was beheading. Beheading, if done correctly with a talented executioner and a sharp blade, was instantaneous death. There was no pain because you're basically severing your nerve, sending pain signals from your brain down to the rest of your body. So if you were lucky, that's how you went. At the bottom of the scale for common criminals was hanging. Hanging is not like we think of in the Wild West movies where there's a trap door that breaks the neck instantly. We're talking about slow strangulation. So this was a very unpleasant way to die. If the executioner was your friend, or maybe you gave him a bribe, he might do you a favor. And as the noose is around your neck, he might give you a sharp tug to actually break your neck so you don't strangle slowly. Most times the execution was made to fit the crime. These were very symbolic. It was important to keep law and order. The most serious crime was, of course, treason. We'll get to that in a second. We mentioned the witchcraft earlier. So if you committed witchcraft or heresy going against the church, you were often burned at the stake. And this was done because you're mimicking the fires of hell that you believe these people were condemned to due to their interlocution with the devil. If you were lucky, you would die of smoke inhalation before the flames actually reach your skin. Or, once again, give a bribe to the executioner and maybe he'll give you a little bit of poison that would actually kill you before the fire got to you, because obviously that is a terrible, terrible way to go. Aside from burning at the stake, there is also being boiled alive in hot oil. This was reserved for counterfeiting. And that seems like a really harsh punishment for counterfeiting. We do not do that to people anymore. But this was seen as a form of treason because on the coins was the local lord or king's head. So the king was guaranteeing that coin is valid. If you fake that coin, you are essentially committing treason by misrepresenting the king. So boiling alive in oil was a common way for that one to go as well. For the very worst forms of treason, you have being hung, drawn, and quartered. So drawn means drawn throughout the streets by your neck or by your head by a horse. So this is sort of public humiliation, which is part of, again, you sinned against the king, so you're going to be exposed like this. Then you are hung, like we mentioned earlier, you're slowly strangled. And then, right as you're losing consciousness, you would generally be disemboweled. If you're a man and you committed a crime that was, maybe you had an affair with a noble lady, you'd also be castrated as well. And then you would blissfully finally then die, but then you would be quartered, so your body would be split after being beheaded into 4 different parts. So it would then be sent in some places to various parts of the castle or city walls, in other places different cities. Maybe you committed a crime of treason in one city, and so maybe your legs are sent over there. And basically as a warning to everyone else, do not ever try this again. There's some more gruesome methods. I mean, they got very creative. This is sawing. So it's exactly what it sounds like. For me, though, I think actually one of the worst is this one, and you guys can pass this one around as well. Broken on the wheel means that you are tied to a giant wooden wheel, and with a hammer, the executioner breaks all of your limbs, and then you're left there. That's it for days. So you slowly starve in horrible pain. You don't have any water. Maybe if you're lucky, you have a friend who's allowed to chase off the vultures, but he's not allowed to give you any food or water, and you slowly die that way. So this all sounds incredibly harsh by our modern standards, and it was. But when you had, all these people, again, living confined within the city, it was considered very, very important to keep people within the sort of social norms of law and order that happened at the time. And everyone went to these executions. Like I mentioned, the gallows was over in Esslingen, and it was essentially a big party. People would come with picnic lunches to watch the executions all the way until about the mid-1700s. That's when that practice fell somewhat out of favor, although for people convicted of treason, you'd still go see the public hanging for people committed of treason. But most of these really exceptional deaths actually went away in the Enlightenment era. This is why the guillotine was invented. I mentioned that if you were being beheaded, an executioner wasn't very good at his job. It could be very torturous and painful. So the guillotine was thinking it was this machine that would remove the human error from the process. It was seen as a humane, rational invention at the time.
I don't know, if you guys had to be tortured, which way would you want to go out? I personally would say the quickest way possible, but definitely not sawn in half. That doesn't sound too fun.
This is the old synagogue of Esslingen. Esslingen actually had a very early Jewish community in the early Middle Ages. Along with Worms and Speyer and Trier, there was actually a Jewish community here as early as the early 1300s. And that community at that time could live wherever they chose. They're mostly based around the Hofenmarkt, where we talked about Anna Katerina. There was a synagogue, a ritual bath, a mikveh, a kosher butcher. And while the Christians and Jewish people kept apart, there was no violence or serious issues between them. That all changed with the arrival of the Black Death, bubonic plague. Christians were getting extremely sick and dying in huge numbers. Meanwhile, the Jewish community was not getting nearly as sick, and far fewer people were dying. This led to the idea amongst the Christians that the Jews were somehow responsible for the plague. They actually accused them of poisoning the wells, the well water everyone had to drink from. And this led to what is known as pogroms. These are mob violence that happened against Jewish communities all over cities in Europe. And the pogrom here in Esslingen in 1350, they actually rounded up and trapped all the Jewish community inside the old synagogue and burned them alive in it. At that point, there was no Jewish presence here until they would come back about 3 or 4 decades later, because the emperor actually gave a writ of protection for a number of Jewish families to live in the city. But at that time, because of the violence and the bad feelings on part of the Christians, they were confined to the Jewish ghetto. We actually passed it just a few blocks back that way on this street. It's what's called the Judengasse, the Jewish alley. Now it's called the Schmalegasse. And there was actually a note saying that it used to be the Judengasse. So you had this very small street, and there would have been gates on both sides, and the Jewish community was actually locked in there at night, but during the day they were allowed to roam free, basically as peddlers. That was one of the only occupations allowed to Jewish people, because the Christians basically didn't want them competing with them for jobs. And so this was a very hard life. Things were very unpleasant, and yet they still persevered until the next wave of plague came. And then you'd also have yet another pogrom. And this cycle happened over and over until the Reformation came to Esslingen and the city became Protestant. And at that point, all of the Jews and the Catholics actually were expelled from the city. It became a Protestant-only town. And the reason why the plague didn't affect the Jewish community so much is because during Jewish ritual practices, hand washing before meals is part of it. They didn't know about germ theory, but they did know that hand washing was ordained by God in their beliefs, and so they would wash their hands, and they just kept separate from the Christians who were getting sick, just naturally, so you had far less death for that reason. That's when Napoleon conquered the Holy Roman Empire, or what was left of it. With the army of Württemberg, Napoleon made the Duke of Württemberg a king, and together they conquered Esslingen and turned it into part of the new Kingdom of Württemberg. And part of Napoleon's belief system was that there should be religious tolerance. So Catholics and Jews were allowed back into the city, and a small Jewish community started to settle here until 1850 or so, when there was enough people to actually purchase this old building as the city synagogue. This used to be the old gold workers guild building from the 1500s. But it was purchased as a synagogue because of the way it faces. You see it's kind of tilted. The back of it actually faces directly due east. And in Jewish belief, you want the altar to be facing towards Jerusalem. And so this was the perfect building because of the way the building faced. And this was the city synagogue all the way until in 1938, in November, the night of Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. This is a night where the Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, got on the radio and basically incited Germans to commit pogroms, to commit violence against the Jewish communities all throughout Germany. And in most places, synagogues were burned. Jewish shops and houses were burned as well, or just destroyed. Windows broken, that's where you get the Night of Broken Glass. And this one, there's actually a mob with torches ready to burn this building down until the mayor came to intervene. And it's not that the mayor wanted to protect the Jews. He was actually an early adopter of the Nazi Party. The reason he didn't want it to burn is, again, we're surrounded by wooden buildings. If this was to get lit on fire, the chance of it spreading to one of these other buildings was extremely high. And actually, in many towns in Germany, this happened. The cities actually burnt down because they lit fire to their synagogues. So while the building wasn't completely burnt down, it was desecrated. All the holy objects were destroyed or stolen, and it actually became a meeting center for the Hitler Youth. And the Jewish community from this area suffered very poorly. Many of the people deported to Theresienstadt and Auschwitz between 1938 and 1942, those who couldn't immigrate.
So, guys, wow, that story is just crazy. Talk about a city that has such a violent, angry past. On the surface, I wouldn't really think that Esslingen would have such a history, but wow, that story about the synagogue was just crazy. I swear, I just saw somebody standing over my shoulder, but wow, guys, I'm borderline speechless, and there's just so much anger and frustration and sadness, in this town, and obviously it's not like that anymore, luckily, but it's just crazy to think how far this city has come and what it's experienced, and yeah, I've got like a very heavy feeling right now, but yeah, wow, it's just very, very crazy to see where this city once was.
You guys have heard of The Devil Went Down to Georgia? Well, this story behind this is The Devil Went Down to Esslingen. The story goes that the devil woke up one day, feeling in a good mood, thought that he would go get some souls. And he thought the market town of Esslingen, which is having a huge market right where we started in the Marktplatz, would be a good place to do it. So he decided to disguise himself. He put on his pair of snazzy trousers, put on a big top hat, looking really great, and he marched right down the Bahnhofstrasse into Esslingen, where he spotted a farmer's wife selling some produce. And he thought, this woman looks like your typical country rube. It'll be very easy to convince her to give me her soul, because all he had to do was complete a transaction, an honest transaction, with her. If he bought something from her and she received the money, then that was it. Her soul was his. And says, "Oh, my good madame, these apples look lovely. How much?" Now, this woman was not an idiot. First of all, she could smell the sulfur that accompanied the devil wherever he went. And then, of course, his trousers were quite ugly and a couple centuries too old in terms of fashion. And as soon as she looks down, she sees instead of boots, there's cloven hooves. So she knows this is the devil trying to trick her, and she's got a plan. So she says, it's just a half pfennig, sir. I will give you my finest apple. So he throws her the coin, and she throws him the apple. And he thinks as soon as he bites into this apple, her soul will be his. And he's laughing to himself as he starts to bite into it. And then all of a sudden, it's not sweet, it's spicy and bitter, and he's all of a sudden screaming in rage. "This isn't an apple, you tricked me, it's nothing but an onion." He just starts screaming, you onion," at her as he disappears in a puff of smoke. And the woman laughed and laughed, and to this day, the people of Esslingen have been referred to as onions. That is their nickname. In German, it sounds a little better. It's Wüblinger. You can't really say onioner. But so Esslingens are very proud of the story. They're proud of the nickname. However, people in Stuttgart, who again, they've always had this rivalry back and forth because they were not part of the same nation, people in Stuttgart said they were onions because they smell funny. So you can choose what you believe. Katharienspittel. I mentioned it during the story of the postman. It is where the nephew who'd murdered his uncle came to collapse and die. Spittel is where we get our word hospital. This was basically an almshouse that took care of the old, the elderly, the infirm, the poor. Anybody who needed help was cared for by monks and nuns in this giant complex that used to take up this entire square. However, today, only this building remains. And this wasn't part of the hospital per se. This was actually the wine cellar, because to fund all these charitable activities, the nuns and the monks actually harvested wine. This is big time wine country, actually the largest wine region in Germany. And so the wine was harvested and pressed and bottled here in this facility and then stored deep in the cellar. So this story takes place in 1581. And at that time, the entire city had gathered to help in the wine harvest, as you did. You have a few short weeks based on weather conditions. Everyone needs to come together and harvest the wine. Things kept getting stolen, especially wine. This is a charitable cause, and yet people are drinking the wine. They're taking it out of the wine cellar and drinking it at home. And he really wanted to put a stop to this. One day, his prayers were answered, because late at night, after a particular day where they'd lost many bottles, everyone's closing up to leave, and a loud bang happens. And then all of a sudden, a whooshing comes from the chimney, and before you know it, there was a small dark figure huddled in the corner of the room, and he starts screaming in this terrible chilling voice, even though he's just a small little guy, and he's screaming at everybody, "I know who the thieves are, I know who the thieves are." And then, like that, all the candles go out. And suddenly, half of the building found themselves being attacked by an invisible force. They were being slapped and smacked upside the bum and just turned over and basically beaten black and blue. And then all of a sudden, in a short while, the candles come back, and there's just a heap of dazed, confused people with everyone else standing trying to figure out what happened. So the bailiff approaches the wine cellar leader, and he says, "Okay, we already have rumors that there's a crocodile in the basement escaped from a circus that's eating people. And now we have some sort of ghost. What are we supposed to do?" And the cellar maker said, "Actually, I believe this was the answer to my prayers. You see, I've been trying to find the thieves, and it seems like everyone who was beaten was actually one of the thieves." And so the bailiff said, "Okay, so the spirit is somehow helpful, but what about the crocodile?" And then the winemaker said, "Actually, it does seem like the crocodile only ate 2 barrel makers who actually cheated me as well." And so the bailiff says, "Okay, this is ridiculous. We've got to stop these crazy events." So they agreed to renovate the building so there would be basically no way for people to steal from them. So the renovation took place in 1582, which is now the name of the restaurant that is here. And to honor the little spirit who helped stop the thieving, they actually made a little monument to him as well. He's that little guy right up there in the corner. And he is called, in local dialect, the Kelter Manle. And so the people who live in Esslingen believe that every time you pass him, first time of the day, you're supposed to greet him, lest he beats you up. So that's when you say, "Hallo Manle," and then you go about the rest of your day, hopefully with some good luck. So that was the tour, everybody. It was really great to have you guys.
Well, guys, that's going to do it for us. Wow, wow, wow. What an amazing tour and opportunity. I just want to give a huge thank you and shout out to Sarah from Stuttgart Steps for hosting us. She is just a truly remarkable human being and just an amazing encyclopedia and wealth of knowledge and information. It's just, I have the utmost respect for tour guides because just the amount of information that is stored in their head, it's truly amazing. It's remarkable. I am going to leave the link to Stuttgart Steps in the description below, so feel free to check them out. As I mentioned earlier, they do wine tours, Christmas market tours, they do all different types of historical tours. So feel free to give them a visit on their website. If you guys did enjoy this video, please give it a huge thumbs up as it really does help the channel out in a number of ways. As always, thank you guys for the continued love and support. We are heading to Turkey at the end of the week. We're really excited for that. Plus, we just have a lot more things to do as we are slowly approaching the holiday season. So stay tuned for more awesome videos. Thank you guys for the continued love and support. Thank you. Mahalo for watching.